Hello, in this video I want to further expand on some themes from my previous video and explain why many historians and political analysts believe that the liberal world order is collapsing. Well, let us start with an observation. For most of human history, war was just a part of everyday life, and there was a very high chance that if you had four brothers that one of them will die in a war. Yuval Noah Harari even claims that in prehistory the chances of dying a violent death, being killed by another human, were roughly the same as chances of a young man born between two wars in Eastern Europe in the first half of the 20th century. So the chances were pretty high, even in prehistory, that you will die in an armed conflict. But after World War II, there was a unprecedented time of peace in certain regions of our planet. Of course, there still were anti-colonial wars, but the wars of conquest rarely happened, and more importantly, great powers did not go to war with each other, and great powers like the United States and the Soviet Union even prevented many wars from escalating too much and kept many of their allies under control. But what began to change recently with war in Ukraine, and then with Hamas-Israel war and Armenia-Azerbaijan war and the escalation of wars in Ethiopia, Yemen, Myanmar, in the Sahel region, jihadism is becoming stronger. Well, there are many elements contributing to this fall of liberal world order, but let us start with the most important element in my humble opinion, and that is the concept of the multipolar world. In a bipolar world and in a unipolar world, most historians agree, it is easier to prevent conflicts. After all, you have one or two great powers controlling their allies and kind of ordering them to stop. It is in the interest of great powers to prevent too much conflict in the world, because war is not good for world trade. Even it is not good for the reputation of those great powers to have their allies fight unnecessary war, which is, for example, why Eisenhower condemned Great Britain, Israel and France in the war of the Suez Crisis. In the same way, the Soviets actually kept some of their allies at bay. For example, Stalin ordered the communists in Iran not to do a revolution. In the same way, he refused to help the Greek communists because he was afraid that that might provoke the West into doing something crazy. So yeah, even if you do not like the United States, you should recognize that there is more peace when there is one big cartel than after the fall of the cartel, when you have smaller gangs trying to control the market. It really is that simple. And the reason why the world before World War One was so chaotic was because we had five or six, roughly speaking, equally powerful states, and each of them felt kind of entitled to starting their own war because of their own interests. But because they all wanted to start a regional war, there was this complex net of alliances that emerged and in the end led entire humanity to war. But even before World War One, there were regional conflicts such as the Balkan Wars and the colonization of Africa that did create tensions between, for example, France and Germany, and even for a long time Great Britain and France. But yeah, in a system in which you have 5 or 6 equally powerful countries, it simply has to be more chaotic, because there isn't 1 or 2 states able to control their allies. And okay, now let us return for a moment back to the period of the Cold War. After World War II, the Soviets conquer Eastern Europe, and they prevent regional nationalisms from emerging and starting wars such as the Hungarian nationalism or Romanian nationalism that went to war with each other after World War One. And the world truly was, relatively speaking, a very stable and a peaceful place, and conflict did occur, but mostly in colonial regions, because colonies wanted freedom. And anti-colonial wars, yes, were happening pretty often, but they were a very controlled type of war. Great powers were still able to prevent wars in regions where they didn't want wars from occurring. For example, Japan and China never went to war. Thailand never attacked its neighbors. In the American continents, there was practically no war. There were some smaller wars, but compared to the 19th century or the first half of the 20th century, the American continents and Europe were pretty stable, and yes, even large parts of Asia, in fact, were pretty stable. There were wars between, for example, India and Pakistan, but we are still not talking about wars that were as huge as, for example, wars that that used to occur in the pre World War II period. And yes, the Soviet Union, with its communist ideology, also held many regional nationalisms at bay. For example, Armenian and Azerbaijani, and for example, the tensions that existed in Georgia between the Abkhazi people and the Georgians. And yes, Yugoslavia is also an example of communism keeping nationalism at bay. But with the fall of communism, the United States emerged as a unipolar power. The Korean War is also an example of a regional war that happened as a result of a misunderstanding. The Soviets simply believed, according to Henry Kissinger, that South Korea is not in the American sphere of influence, and therefore Stalin believed that Kim Il-sung can conquer it and unite his country. The war in Vietnam also, Northern Vietnam was kind of forced to conquer Southern Vietnam due to the lack of grain in their country. Their economy was dependent on the grain from the south, which created this unfortunate situation in which the North Vietnamese people had no choice but to attack an American ally, and that is why there was war in Vietnam. And also, of course, yes, the anti-colonial wars were mainly a consequence of the fact that in many regions of the world, the colonial powers were simply unwilling to peacefully withdraw. But even the United States, which is interesting, even the United States in many of these conflicts actually condemned European colonial powers, because the United States also did not want to fully ruin its reputation in the third world. For example, the war between the Dutch and the Indonesians would probably last much longer if it wasn't for the United States kind of openly condemning the Dutch for their colonialism, not to mention that the Soviets supplied the Indonesian people with guns, which was also pretty important. But yeah, definitely, I would argue that both sides in the process of anti-colonial struggle actually did play a good role. I'm talking about the United States and the Soviet Union, but mostly the Soviet Union, because they did supply all anti-colonial movements with weapons, but at the same time they were exploiting Eastern Europe economically. That also needs to be mentioned. And yes, with the fall of communism, the unipolar world emerges, and some would even argue that the unipolar moment was when the world was the most stable. There were some regional imperialists like Saddam Hussein that tried to conquer Kuwait, but then the United States responded by attacking Iraq. And the first war in Iraq, I would argue, definitely made the world a more stable place. It sent a message to all local imperialists that the United States will attack them if they try to conquer their neighbors. And I do believe that even if the Soviets had won the Cold War, that the world would also be a very stable place for a while, because to return back to the cartel metaphor, yes, having one great mafia family or a cartel control the region will make it more stable. But there was also one other factor that, at least for a while, was making the world a more stable place. There was this great emergence of democracies all around the world after the end of the Cold War. For a moment, Russia was a democracy, a flawed democracy, but nonetheless a democracy. China was at its most democratic. Most European countries were democracies. For example, Hungary was a democracy, Serbia was a democracy. Now, no longer, these two states are no longer democracies. If you have been following what's happening in Serbia and Hungary, for example, in recent days. But okay, so why did this Clinton and Fukuyamaist ideology of economic liberalism leading to political liberalism, why did it not work? Well, in my humble opinion, this theory never actually made that much sense. I simply do not see a reason for economic liberties to lead to political liberties. We are talking about two different spheres. And in my opinion, that was an unjustified assumption from the beginning. But the irony is that Russia and China, by becoming integrated in the global market, actually managed to become, relatively speaking, rich countries and invest a lot in their military. And that, in the long run, made them actually even more dangerous. And not to mention that the war in Iraq became an example of a bigger country unjustly attacking a smaller country for probably imperialist reasons. And Putin was kind of the first leader that began to use the Iraq war in order to justify his imperialism. And he used to, I would say as a joke, respond to Western journalists when they asked him, "Why are you attacking Georgia?" He responded by saying, "I'm doing the same thing that the Americans did in Iraq." So the war in Iraq, I would argue, in the long run also destabilized the world and made Russia and China more popular in certain regions of the world. And many historians now argue that due to this rise in Chinese power, that sooner or later war with Taiwan will happen. I am not sure, but it is definitely possible, and I do think that China is looking at war in Ukraine and trying to draw conclusions. If Russians manage to conquer the entirety of Ukraine and turn this war again in their favor, I do think that it makes the Chinese invasion of Taiwan more likely. And, well, and the irony of Russia becoming integrated in the global market is that, according to some historians, it actually made Putin more willing to attack his neighbors, not less, which is exactly the opposite of what Bill Clinton believed. So some historians are convinced that Putin simply believed that nobody will sanction him because the world became, well, many regions of the world became kind of incapable of buying enough oil from other parts of the world. They became dependent on Russian oil and on Russian grain. And because of it, Putin probably believed that the world won't sanction him to the extent that it did. And yeah, this war is also destabilizing Somalia, for example, that's heavily dependent on Russian and Ukrainian grain that for a while was not being exported to Somalia. And yeah, in my opinion, this war in Ukraine kind of started an avalanche of wars all across the world. Even if Hamas was not trained by Wagner, which I do find to be a very convincing theory, because the war between Israel and Hamas is in the interest of Putin, but even if they weren't trained by Wagner, Hamas surely realized that the United States is already engaged in one big war, and it was the golden opportunity for them to attack Israel, the ally of the United States. Azerbaijan realized the same thing about Armenia. The great protector of Armenia, Russia, is engaged in war in Ukraine, therefore it is the golden opportunity for them to attack. And many analysts believe that Venezuela is kind of preparing for invasion of Guyana. Recently, Venezuela mobilized its troops across the border from the oil fields in Guyana. That could result in a war. There is also another conflict happening as a result of the United States empire withdrawing from the Middle East. ISIS and the Taliban are beginning to fight. There was an emergence of ISIS in Afghanistan after the United States left from Afghanistan. And that actually reminds me of Great Britain withdrawing from India, which then caused wars between India and Pakistan to occur. And recently, Kim Jong-un said that North Korea is preparing for war. Now, he might be lying or just bluffing, but yeah, maybe he also realized, well, now is my moment to do something crazy. And what's actually very interesting about war in Ukraine is that it could be seen as a proxy war between South and North Korea. I mean, North Korea alone sent more shells to Russia than the entire European Union combined, but then South Korea kind of heroically stepped in on the side of Ukraine and sent an enormous amount of shells to Ukraine. I believe almost as much as the entire European Union. So it's actually, the conflict in Ukraine is actually a proxy war between two Korean states. And well, if we can learn anything from recent history, it is that when imperialist countries start to invade and when the international community does nothing or not much, it will only embolden other expansionist regimes to do the same. When Japan attacked China between two wars, Mussolini realized, well, the League of Nations is really not doing much. They just condemned Japan and that was it, pretty much. And because of it, Mussolini attacked Ethiopia. And then Hitler looked at Mussolini and Japan and realized, well, this League of Nations really isn't doing much to keep peace in the world. And he started his own imperialist project as a result of that ineffectiveness of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was much more ineffective than the UN, by the way. I mean, the Soviets, for the most part, were not a part of the League of Nations because they were communist. The United States withdrew due to their isolationism. One of the first things that Hitler did, he withdrew from the League of Nations. So, yeah, I mean, there actually weren't that many countries in the League of Nations. And not to mention that the British and the French were busy controlling their colonial empires, so they also didn't want to go to war with Japan and Italy. And there is one other factor, global warming. Global warming, according to many analysts, is making wars in Ethiopia and the Sahel region even worse. In the certain parts of Ethiopia, there are droughts leading to rebellions. So global warming is one of the factors making many regional conflicts even worse. So yeah, we have a multipolar world, a fall of democracy, and global warming. All of these three factors kind of creating a perfect shitstorm that's making the world order to crumble. And I do want to try and answer the question: why did Putin attack Ukraine recently? Why not? Why didn't he do it before, when Ukraine had a weaker military? Well, honestly, I don't know. Maybe he saw that there was inflation in the world, so he became convinced that other countries won't sanction him. Maybe he was waiting to strike a deal with China. I mean, as far as I know, Russia and China were not that great, were not in really that friendly relationship until recently. So maybe the Chinese factor was truly what was preventing Putin from attacking earlier. I don't know. Maybe he simply realized that he's an old man and that he needs to attack right now if he wants to see his dream come true. And yeah, one way to look at this conflict in Ukraine is that it kind of was a miracle that the Soviet Union collapsed relatively peacefully, if you take into account that it was the biggest country in the world. And yeah, it truly was, its collapse truly was relatively peaceful when you compare it to, for example, the collapse of Yugoslavia. But in the great irony of history, it turns out that if you look at what happened 30 years after, that it wasn't so peaceful. And Umberto Eco argues that fascism almost always occurs after the people of a certain nation experience a traumatic event. And for the Russian people, that was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Putin ideology, in a great irony of history, while it does see itself as an anti-fascist ideology fighting the Nazis in Ukraine, it is actually one of the closest things to fascism that we have today in the world. It occurred after this great traumatic event. It is nostalgic about the golden past. It is expansionist. It is militaristic. It sees pacifism as treason. It is economically isolationist. So yeah, these are all similarities between Russia and many other fascist countries that existed back in the day. But okay, that's all for this video, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you liked this video.